dealer in New York for a long time. And I'm sure, I happened to read that he got interested in Hollywood and films really completely by chance. He wandered into a bookstore, this is correct, many years ago, and picked up an unsigned photograph of, was it Garbo? Garbo, and that got him started. Anyway, he divides his time between Norfolk and New York. He's also on the board of trustees of the Hartford Athenaeum, and we're delighted to have him with us. On my other side is Dan Dwyer, who many of you I think may know. Dan has for many years run an amazingly wonderful rare bookstore in Salisbury called Johnny Cake Books. He's also been very active on the political scene and also has been center stage involved with the Lakeville Journal. He now is, he's very much involved with the foundation that the journal set up. And he also reviews films for a German magazine that's driving me crazy. Its name is called Blumken's.
Actually, it's stage musicals that I review.
Stage musicals. He's passionate about stage musicals, so he's the right person, and he loves Hollywood, so he's the right person for this. And this magazine, whose name I can't remember, is called Blickpunkt. Anyway, he has a website, you can read his reviews, and Dan is going to talk to Robert about Ferocious Ambition. So.
Yeah, please. I'm going to show a couple of slides first, and then a very short bit of film before Dan and I start talking. Jane reminded me of something which I had forgotten. Indeed, back in 1980, I was walking across 57th Street in New York, and it was those days when there were lots of galleries, and we would go into galleries, and there was a photography dealer named Lee Witkin, and I was buying all sorts of photographs, not necessarily Hollywood. I'd never bought a Hollywood photograph. And in one of the bins that bookstores, print sellers, photo sellers had back in those days, I pulled this photograph of Garbo out, and he had a price on it of, $100, but it was 1980. And I said, this is a beautiful photograph, 11 by 14. And I said, it's a beautiful photograph. It was by this woman named Ruth Harriet Louise. And I said, who's Ruth Harriet Louise? He said, I don't have any idea. And I said, if you don't have any idea who Ruth Harriet Louise is, how can you charge $100? And I bought it. I guess I got it for $90. He said, because you're standing here holding it, we're talking about it, is why it's $100. So I bought the photograph. And so 6 months later, let's say, I get a call from Lee Witkin's assistant saying, we have another Ruth Harriet Louise photograph. And I'm thinking, who the heck is Ruth Harriet Louise? Because I bought one photograph. I now have probably 500 photographs of Ruth Harriet Louise, but this was back then. And I said, what do you have? And we have a Joan Crawford. And I said, well, I was living in New York. I said, next time I'm walking by, I'll go up and look at it. So that photo was $50. And I said, well, why was Garbo $100 and Crawford only $50? And he looked at me, because it's Joan Crawford. Everybody knows that she's. So this was my first real introduction to Joan Crawford as the discounted Garbo. So it just by chance, I just wrote a book on Garbo. Now I've written one on Crawford. Garbo was a complete failure as a book. And this, the first printing sold out before publication. So someplace Crawford, who 40 years ago was the discounted brand, is now outpacing Garbo like 3 or 4 to 1. So here. So a little bit because Jane reminded me of that story. Ferocious Ambition is the book. So I'm going to stand back because I don't want to be. These are some early pictures of Crawford. I'm sure most of you can conjure an image, but this is a little aid memoir. The upper left, Crawford as a beautiful child that became a beautiful woman. In the center, she had a very short, about a 6-week time as a chorus girl in New York at the Winter Garden Theater at one of the Follies in the fall of 1924. She was in the back of the line. You know, she didn't have any lines or anything, but she did have the opportunity to wear this spectacular outfit and then pose for it. At the lower left, when she first came to Hollywood at the beginning of 1925, when she was an ingenue with this very young and fresh. And then I think many of you know about her fame as a dancer, particularly a Charleston dancer. She would be at the studio all day, and at night she'd go to the nightclubs, and these are some of the cups that she won for dancing Charleston.
Wow.
Then in the 20s, she started becoming much better known. She started making more serious movies. So three portraits by Ruth Harriet Louise for different films made during the period. These are all from about 1928. And we're beginning to see the evolution of the face of Crawford that is now well known to all of us. And then in 1930, Crawford became a movie star. And becoming a movie star was not, I think, the way a lot of us think a movie star is. It was a very calculated decision from the studios. Being a movie star meant your name was over the title. I mean, it really is that simple. So if it's Joan Crawford in, she's a movie star. If it's such and such a movie with Joan Crawford, she's not a movie star. Now today we think of everybody as a movie star, but in that period it was very, very specific. So these are from the very early 30s. Crawford has been declared a movie star because her films are very successful. She also, you might notice a little bit of a change in the way she looks. She managed somehow, and I don't know how she did it, from 27, 28, 29, to will herself into sleek, svelte, and beautiful. And I think all of us would like to know how you do that, but she managed to do it. And once she got there, she really never let it go. Then in the later period, Crawford on the left, and a Karsh photograph taken in the middle 40s. In the center with her last husband, the Pepsi Cola chief, Al Steele, and their magnificent Billy Haynes design department on Fifth Avenue. And then, you know, Crawford, she loved to have her picture taken. She says she was the most photographed girl in Hollywood. Then she became the most photographed woman in Hollywood, and then she continued to be one of the most photographed people on the planet. She loved to pose, she loved clothes. So I'm going to show a short clip from Grand Hotel. And if you're, see if we can do it. It runs about 3 minutes. I just wanted to give you a little bit of Crawford acting. This is Grand Hotel from 1932.
You know, I've often wondered what had happened to that old porter if somebody jumped on him from here.
I'm sure I don't know. Why don't you try it and find out?
Thanks very much.
Not at all?
That's him, John Garbo she's with.
Don't you like dancing?
No, not with strangers.
Never.
Never?
Thanks very much.
Not at all?
I say,
Are you back again?
you know, he must be an awful nice fellow.
Who?
Whoever's keeping you waiting.
Oh. Have you seen it?
Seen what?
Yes.
Oh, you don't mean 166?
Mm-hmm.
That fat, bulbous neighbor of mine?
Pricing.
Oh, not you.
Oh, no, no. Work.
Does he sing?
I hope not.
Weren't you playing something?
Yes, the typewriter.
Oh, you're a little stenographer.
Yes, I'm a little stenographer.
That's fascinating. I don't suppose you'd take some dictation from me sometime, would you? Well, how about some tea then?
Tea would spoil my dinner. I only have one meal a day, and I'd rather hate to spoil it.
Oh, are you reducing?
Reducing?
Hmm.
Me? Do I need to?
Oh no. It's perfect. You know, I don't think I've ever... But, why one meal a day?
Money. Ever heard of it?
Yes, I have vaguely. But I always thought little stenographers made little pennies.
Very little.
Oh, that's too bad.
Did you ever see a stenographer with a decent frock on?
I have indeed.
One she'd bought herself?
Oh, I see what you mean. Poor kid. Oh, I wish I were free tonight.
Aren't you?
What?
Free.
No, darn it, I'm not. But there's tomorrow.
What time tomorrow?
5 o'clock downstairs.
Where downstairs?
In the funny yellow room where they dance.
You're funny.
Tomorrow?
Of course.
Really? We'll, dance.
All right. We'll dance.
So much sex.
Yeah, it's sort of incredible, excuse me, but just because I watched this on the little screen, and to see it now on the big screen is, we live in a world with all these movies, you know, it's 3 minutes long, would have 40 cuts. And this only had one cut where he went back, but most of it, but by keeping it animated, they continued to walk around each other. And it was just, the direction was brilliant, because I mean, I can't speak for all of you, but it's hard to take your eyes off of them, because, you know, it's not just two people standing there talking. It's this ballet that they're doing, you know, makes it exciting.
Who directed it?
Edmund Goulding, 1932.
Fabulous.
And she was how old there?
Let's see, she's born in 05, so 27.
But she admits to 08.
She admits to 08. Oh, yeah. Yeah, she was a liar about a lot of things that women are allowed to lie about. And first of all was her age, which in some of her chronologies, when you start working backward, it doesn't make any sense. But she stood by 1908, come hell or high water.
Before we get into the guts of the book, we have a small world story that we can share that relates this to a very local kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, it was, Dad and I have been chatting, looking forward to today. And I found out, let's start 20 years ago, I was in, of all places, the Tetons. And in the Tetons, I was staying with somebody named Skip Tilt. And we were talking about one thing or another, and it turned out that his home was in Salisbury, and, you know, I'm in Norfolk, so blah, blah, blah. And he said, yeah, and his father had been a fellow named Colby Chester, who was very well known up here because he had founded and run General Foods and blah, blah, blah. So I didn't think any more of it. So 20 years later, I'm working with Joan Crawford, and I find this whole series of letters between Joan Crawford and a woman named Jeannie Chester. And I didn't even think for a moment until I found a photograph of Joan Crawford with Colby Chester. And I thought, goodness. So, and I got in touch with now Skip's widow, and oh yes, Aunt Jean, and she lived up here, and blah, blah, blah. And I found out that Jeannie had been a good friend of Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was Joan Crawford's first husband, and that's how they met. And Crawford was the sort of person who, you know, never gave up a friend, wrote 10 letters a day her whole life, you know, kept in touch with everybody. So when I met with Dan a few weeks ago, we were talking about this, and I said, you know, I have this sort of funny story. And then you said,
Jim and I live in Jeannie Chester's house. At Salisbury. And this sort of made sense because we've been in the house since 1989, and Jeannie Chester died, I think, in 87 or 88. And I remember driving down Salmon Kill Road sometime on a beautiful spring day in 1989 or 88, presumably months after she had died. And there was a large tent on the lawn. And clearly there was some kind of service or memorial party going on. And out of the corner of my radar celebrity eye, I spotted Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And he was in a white suit with that dashing crop of white hair. And it didn't make sense to me until later that I learned that Jeannie was a good friend of Douglas Fairbanks. But it wasn't until I read your book that I knew that Joan Crawford was her first husband.
Right, and that Jeannie was part of the connection, because they divorced in the earliest 30s, but Crawford and Jeannie stayed friends forever.
As long as we're on the topic of Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and I want to ask a question about how Joan got to Hollywood to begin with, but was she such a manipulator, a mover, or so ambitious that she saw, because she really didn't love Douglas Fairbanks Jr., did she see the marriage as a way for her to affix herself in Hollywood society and legitimize her role in that society?
Yes.
Yeah. And he was, when they met, she was 22 and he was 17?
Yeah. Oh, right, no, she was, but of course she was admitting too much younger. I mean, I think that was part of the early age thing, was to make her a more appropriate girlfriend to young 17-year-old Doug, whose parents, his father was, of course, the great Douglas Fairbanks, one of the biggest stars ever in silent film. And his stepmother was Mary Pickford. They lived at the House Pickford. They were the ruling royalty of Hollywood, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. And Doug Jr. was, even at 17, was handsome, erudite, musical art. He never went to college, but he went to these fancy prep schools, could talk about everything, all the girls. And Joan Crawford took one look at him and thought, well, I don't mind him, but I like everything he comes with.
Mm-hmm.
And she knew this would be a pull.
Yeah. Wow. Before she got to that point, let's back up. She was born in San Antonio. And grew up in Kansas City. And at the age of what, 16, 15, 17, she decides to go to Detroit and to get a job as a dancer. Can you fill in a little bit more about that? And what was that like for a young woman at that point to do?
It is so murky. She admitted to being at about, maybe 6th grade was the last one she finished. Then she went to probably the equivalent of 7th and 8th grades, but she was, her parents were divorced. She was living with her mother. They were so poor that she would be in these schools, but basically she would be there as a maid. They would educate her, but she'd have to work for her meals. And she talks about it, as hellish, being a 13-year-old girl who's having to make the beds and clean up after the food. But she's still a minor, and she didn't have very many options. But by the time she's 15, 16, for some peculiar reason, she ends up at Stevens College at Columbia, Missouri. And everybody, we know she went there. She's in a yearbook, but she lasted not quite a semester. She wasn't academically qualified. She was also work study. So she said it was the same thing. I spent all my time cooking and cleaning for the rich girls. But, by now we're talking, young women who are a bit older than she was. So she left after the first semester with the president of the college, perfectly said, Joan, this isn't working. She wasn't Joan then. She was actually Lucille Lusser, or she called herself Billy. So what she wanted to be was a dancer, and as many young women who were interested in performing, there was a sign on a theater door in Kansas City auditioning for dancers, and she answered it and got a short job. It's hard for us to imagine today people who are this dirt poor in places like rural Oklahoma in the 20s. She was probably working for 50 cents a week, and they were going to roadhouses and dancing. And the unfortunate reality, we're in a world where we have to be very careful of what we say, but most of these women were essentially prostitutes. This is They were there dancing in bars for men in rural Oklahoma. And Joan was always fairly candid about her past, perhaps not as candid as I just was, but her ambition was such that she kept trying to get herself working in better clubs. She finally ended up in Chicago. She found a booking agent. I mean, absolutely bottom rung of booking agents, but there were people who were booking burlesque houses. I mean, not every booking agent is sending you to Hollywood. Everything that is in performance has a booking person, of some sort or another, and she was at the bottom of it. But at least she had somebody giving her jobs who finally got her a fairly good job at a club in Detroit. And there she met one of the Schubert brothers, and she claims that maybe accidentally, maybe not, she knocked his drink off the table. Notice her, but notice he did. And he basically said, if you come to New York, you can dance in the back of one of my shows. Again, it was rewards for attentive women, and so she got into New York in the summer, fall of 1924. And then her great break was, she said that we would do 2 or 3 shows in the theaters. These were reviews. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, when the last show was over, they would go to nightclubs and be waitresses and dance again, because they were so desperate for money. She said she was living in like 6 women were sharing, a 1 room. I mean, it's like those movies where and she met an MGM producer named Harry Raff.
Just like the scene with Crystal Allen and the women on the payphone in the hallway. Exactly.
Although a lot younger.
Yes.
A lot, but yes, precisely. And Harry Raff became really her mentor. He was one of the 3 who ran MGM. He brought her to Hollywood. He gave her a 90-day contract, which she never had any contract. I mean, 90 days was forever. And I'm sure she thought, I can dance in LA as well as I can dance in New York or any place else. And she turned 90 days into 70 years.
And that's a competitive environment. There were hundreds of MGM contract players. Any one woman, young girl, a young woman, as pretty as talented as the rest, as shapely as the rest. How did she distinguish herself?
Well, one of the ways she distinguished herself was being 5'2" and weighed 145 pounds and couldn't act or dance or sing. But unlike a lot of men and women who go to Hollywood with great ambitions, she was perfectly aware of her lack of any abilities. But what she knew is that she wanted to succeed. So again, she wrote very candidly. She said, I would talk to anybody who would talk to me. She said, I learned the business. She would ask Marion Davies, who was a big MGM star, could I watch on the side of the set you work? She would stand there all day and watch Marion Davies work. And she would stand there and, like, what is it that Marion Davies is doing? Aside from the fact that she had William Randolph Hearst, which is, also, but she's there, there's something that makes her work on the screen. She got to know technicians. She learned about lighting. She went to dance classes. She learned to walk. She developed that magnificent carriage because at MGM in the 20s, there was somebody there to teach you. And then she got put in very small parts, merely small parts, a little better part. It's all silence. There's no speaking. But it took her about 40 films where she was the person who would do any movie the producers wanted her to do. And you hear all these stories about Katharine Hepburn complaining, Bette Davis complaining, spending all of their time telling everybody what they're not going to do. Crawford was, yes, sir. Yes, Dan. What time would you like me to be there? You want me there at 6 a.m.? I'll be there at 5. This was quite refreshing. And she was the one, person that was reliable. And she was, dieting. I don't know what she was doing, but she was learning the business.
And how did she not get cut from the transition from the silence to the talkies?
Well, you heard her voice.
Yeah. But that was trained. That's an MGM trained kind of diet.
Well, remember by the time she becomes a star, which is exactly the same moment of talkies, 1929, she gets her start at the talkies come. She was aware. She was aware you need, but she would see Vilma Banky, who nobody could understand. That there were these exotics. Hollywood was filled with exotics, or the biggest male star was Roman Navarro. I'm sure Crawford was savvy enough to say he might be the most beautiful man in the world, but they're not going to start having Mexican accents in the movies. You know, I mean, it's you know, these prejudices were. So she learned how to be the all-American woman who was also a size 1 and moved like a clipper ship.
So what was her big breakthrough role that made her a reliable contract actress to above the title movie star?
Our Dancing Daughters. And you know, it's interesting, it's called Our Dancing Daughters. It's a silent film, of course. And it shows, it's the last bit of Joan Crawford as this, you know, kinetic, you know, career girl who, you know, was jumping on tables and dancing. There's a kind of franticness. She looks wonderful. You know, she's surrounded by the best of the young crop of people. And that's the movie that made her a star, but it wasn't the image that MGM started shaping once talking pictures came. And, you know, I was talking a minute ago about the ballet that Goulding did. You know, cameras couldn't move much in these days. You know, the first talking films were very static. So directors had to do things to make it interesting. So the kinds of jazz age pictures that were so popular in silent films, motion pictures didn't have the technology to film. So they started putting her into these dramas. And some director said, okay, Joe, we know how good you are active. Why don't you try still? You know, and even in that clip, the way she lets the camera just come right to her, just the moving of her neck. And once she, you know, then she could do anything.
Did she learn that technique from the still photographers that she cultivated friendships with?
Still photography is critical. It's still an unheralded part of the history of motion pictures, even to somewhat today. What I learned, you know, years ago is performers like Crawford, Garbo here, it doesn't matter. Before they ever made a movie, they spent hours and hours in these portrait studios, which aren't the headshots that we think of. These are you're there all day and they light you and they figure out your face. They figure out your face with makeup, sometimes clothing, somewhat lighting. And then they take these photographs to the producers who look at them and say, all right, I think because it's so expensive, particularly then, to run any film. Film was hugely expensive. So you never put an unknown in front of a camera and just say, let's see how it works. Because every time a piece of film went through, you know, there's 60 people on the set, all of whom have to be paid. So, you know, not even Garbo, you know, just shows up and then it starts making a movie. You know, you can do that today because everything's inexpensive in a way, you know, you can start with video, you know, but in those days. So again, the portrait photographers are the ones who really figured out her face in the first place.
Mm. You mentioned MGM and the three big stars in the 30s emerged with Crawford, or along with Crawford, were Garbo and Norma Sherrod. Now, that's a very competitive environment, and you would think that Crawford's at a competitive disadvantage because Garbo has this incredible international allowance and glamour, and Sherrod is married to Thalberg, the head of the studio. So how did Crawford basically navigate competitive disadvantage?
And then you had Marion Davis, who was the fourth of MGM's queens, who had William Randolph Hearst. Right. So what Crawford knew from day one is that Garbo had Mr. Mayer, who owned the studio. Scherer had Mr. Thalberg, her husband, who was the top producer of the studio. And Davies had William Randolph Hearst, who controlled all the publicity, and then through the newspapers. So she understood that she was going to get fourth pick, but she was going to make fourth pick into entirely her own. And she always had this producer, Harry Raff, who I mentioned, but she always had this great relationship with Raff. You know, he's the one who kept maneuvering her. He would, you know, different shows. For a while, she was making Westerns. I mean, if you can imagine Joan Crawford making silent Westerns. But, you know, they needed somebody for silent Westerns. So she made 2 or 3. And I'm sure Harry Raff's position was, we got to keep her working, you know. And by doing all of these things 40 films later, you know, and it's later that when we get into the late 40s, when Crawford is now at a whole different point of her career and ends up leaving MGM, another actress appears. And I know she said to herself, I don't mind being second, third, or fourth fiddle to Garbo and Cher, but I'm not going to be second fiddle to Greer Garson.
Yeah.
You know, that enough is enough.
So she went to Warner.
So I went to Warner Brothers.
Before we jump ahead that far, let's talk a little bit about her personal life. That you're kind of circumspect about it in the book. I mean, there are references in there that, but it's not basically a gossip. It's a meticulously researched and very authoritative book. But one of the things that did jump out at me is that she had an on again, off again, intimate affair with Clark Gable the whole while.
Yes, probably the great love of each of their lives was Crawford and Gable. They co-starred 7 times in the pictures, many of her best films are with him. I figure that they never got married because they knew if they got married, it would spoil a perfect relationship that, you know, went on and off depending on marriages and, you know, the things that, I mean, but really from 1930 to 1950. There's articles in the fan magazines in the late 40s, and it'll say, you know, Clark Gable and Joan Crawford were spotted together dancing at Cambo, and you think, 1948. I mean, these two, you know, you know, they stuck. But you know, Crawford had 4 husbands. Fairbanks the first, I mentioned, Steele, who ran Pepsi Cola. Second was Francho Cone, and third was a very minor actor named Philip Terry. None of them lasted very long, except Steele, and he died.
So she had not an aversion, not a success record with marriage, but she wanted to have children, and without spending a lot of time on Christina Crawford's Mommy Dearest, that has come to define Crawford more than you think it should, obviously. How did she get away? How did she manage to adopt 4 children at a time when, and it not being a big deal in news?
I learned so many things writing this book that had never crossed my mind. And, you know, some, maybe it's naive or it's just, but in the, I don't know when it began, 20s, 30s, 40s, there were baby mills. These are facts. We don't like to talk about it. You know, how the babies got conceived and born, you know, and they were always in places like Tennessee and Arkansas. I mean, there were baby mills, you know, in Lakeville. And, you know, there were places, but I'm you know, it's places where there were women who had this, and blonde babies is what everybody wanted. I mean, you know, this is like, you know, breeding, you know, dogs. So, you know, these poor young women who were blonde and attractive, didn't have a nickel. Parents, you know, I mean, who knows, it's either like go up in the Appalachian, you know, and they would pay them to have babies. And they would really, you know, and there was one in particular in Tennessee that supplied a lot of children to the Hollywood folks. So Crawford bought these babies.
Wow.
It is as simple as that. And she adopted 5. One she returned. Well, no, I mean, it's contractual because the mother found out for some, you know, and I'm not sure we even know exactly why, that her baby had been adopted by Crawford. She didn't want the baby back. She wanted money. And Crawford would have happily given her money, but Crawford was shrewd enough to know this will never end. And you know, it's not just about my ability to give this woman what she wants. It's the fact that she could traumatize this child for the rest of her life, you know, wanting things. So Crawford returned the child, who actually was adopted by somebody else, and much later wrote a book about it.
But in your study of Joan, do you think she had any legitimate parenting or maternal instinct, or was this none? So why did she do it?
Oh, vanity.
Okay.
Vanity. You know, she wanted, what do we call them now? She wanted mini-me's.
Yeah.
She wanted, you know, Christina was a mini-me.
Right.
And she would dress her up. I mean, everybody see the picture, you know, Joan, they would wear matching mother-daughter outfits. Then she thought it was a good idea to adopt a little boy. You know, Crawford always had a very tricky relationship with men. And, you know, I'm not a shrink, so it's, you know, but you just see her relationships with men and the way she treated this little boy. Then she adopted 2 girls. She was much better with, not with Christina, but the later ones. But, you know.
And the boy, Christopher, is totally estranged from, was totally
Oh,
estranged.
completely, no, he was, well, it's, those of you who might remember the movie, she tied him into bed every night. You know, so he couldn't get out. And then I find that that was not an uncommon practice, you know, I thought, well, this is just sadistic, and like, oh, no, little boys were considered trouble, so their nurses would tie them in, and, you know, so Crawford came by this in a way, honestly, but the girls never got tied, you know, it was.
How much do you, as a student of Hollywood and as now an authority on Joan Crawford, resent not so much Christina Crawford's book, Mommy Dearest, but the campiness of the movie version with Faye Dunaway?
I read Mommy Dearest when this project got presented to me as a possibility. And the first thing I had to do was talk to Harry Raff's granddaughter and say, he's the producer at MGM. And she said, don't worry about it. Crawford was my grandfather's mistress. So, I mean, you know, how did she get to Hollywood? So then I read Mommy Dearest, which I read 40 years before. I practically wept reading this book. Mommy Dearest was the first book ever written from the survivor's point of view, a child survivor about growing up in an abusive home. Now it's an industry. 2 books a day are written on some aspect, you know, my alcoholic great grandfather, you know, it doesn't matter. Everybody's got a book, but this was the first one. And it's not just the horror stories. It was actually a pretty sympathetic description of growing up in a very glamorous Hollywood mansion with a crazy mother. You know, and Christina herself understood the complexity of the situation. So I came away with it believing every word that Christina wrote, because whether or not everything was factually true, and I think it's something that when you read these sorts of books, you have to believe the author believes it, you know, even if something is a little wacky. You know, if you're writing a story about an event that, you know, is peculiar of some sort, you know, it can't have the sense of being made up. And, you know, these have to be authentic feelings, particularly if it's from a children's point of view, because who remembers really how we felt when we were 8 or 10, even if there was a bad experience around it. The movie is something entirely different, and Christina Crawford disassociated herself from it. The movie was not written from a child's point of view. It was written and performed from Faye Dunaway's point of view, who did this arch caricature that we all remember. And, you know, Dan referred to drag queens. Drag queens over the last 40 years don't imitate Joan Crawford. They imitate Faye Dunaway. Who imitate Joan Crawford.
So Bette Davis finally did get the upper hand. They're still doing Bette Davis.
Because, you know, we all think that Crawford beat up Christina with the coat hanger. Well, Christina never said she hit her. Now, she did come in the room and lose her mind because she found a wire hanger, because at 3 o'clock in the morning, I mean, she was drunk, she wasn't working, she probably didn't have a guy, you know, she had the midnight blues and she was manic depressive, and, you know, Christina was there and she exploded, you know, so these things did happen.
Speaking of the alcoholism, how did she manage that through her career? Was she essentially what people commonly now refer to as functional alcoholic?
Well, she started out not drinking at all, you know, which was interesting. So she didn't come to alcohol until late, but when she took it up with, you know, a certain kind of enthusiasm. And then, yeah, from the time she was about 40 through her 50s, she was, yeah, a functional alcoholic. And she wasn't. She appeared on the Lucy show. Some of you might remember the Lucy show back in the 60s, and she was so drunk that Lucy wanted to fire her. And she's like, you know, if you remember these shows, they would film in 5 days. So they would show up, they would read, they would block, you know, and on Friday they would film in front of a live audience. So if you decided you were going to get rid of Joan Crawford, who's already been advertised as coming up, you know, on Saturday, like, what do? You know, this is, you know, huge money. You know, Lucy was the biggest show there was. And, you know, and Lucy writes about this, you know, she would come in, she didn't know her lines, blah, blah, blah. But on the fifth day, there was a live audience, and Crawford went out and was completely letter perfect. You know, she just looked out, saw the people. She was such a pro that she had memorized the script. I don't think she was deliberately driving Lucy crazy. I think she was, you know, she was an alcoholic. That you know, it's speaking of survivor stories, we've read, or know people, what alcohol can do.
Yeah.
And it, some days you're fine and some days you're not. And Crawford was such a professional that when she needed to be spot on, she was until Christina was appearing on The Secret Storm, or one of the soap operas, and some of you might remember that too. And Crawford, without telling Christina, who she was in the hospital for a 4-day surgery or something, took her role as a 22-year-old, and she was so drunk, that it's unfortunate that none of these tapes survive. So we don't actually see her, but there's so much written about. When she was drunk on camera. It was the first time ever.
I'm sure a lot of people have questions. I've got one more clarifying question. I don't think you tell the story in the book, but you dedicate a chapter to the famous Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And of course, that begets the whole, fascination with the Bette Davis and Joan Crawford bitchery. But is it true or is it not true that Betty Davis actually did kick Joan Crawford in the scene when she's down on the floor in Baby Jane?
She doesn't kick her in the film. I mean, you never see her kicking, but you never, it's cut from,
Right.
We don't know.
Okay.
But she hated her.
Yeah.
So, if she did, she wanted to.
People must have some questions about, please.
I was wondering if Christina,
No.
I didn't hear the question. One.
if he has communicated at all with Christina
Christina is now,
before.
okay.
Robert,
Yes.
can you repeat the question?
The question was, did I communicate with Christina? I've written quite a few biographies. And in fact, the first one I wrote was on this photographer I mentioned with Harry Louise. And one of my interviews was with Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who had been a subject of hers. And it was in my long conversation with Douglas Fairbanks Jr., it began to tell me that you should never talk to anybody who had a close relationship with the person you're writing about, because they always have an agenda, especially if it's a long time ago. And I remember talking to Fairbanks, who is, her dad said he was charming and handsome and available. And I asked him a series of questions, and I realized he was giving me packaged responses. I mean, at this point, he was probably in the 70s. It also became something that I learned interviewing the folks from Times Past. So I would try to come up with a question that I knew he didn't have an answer to, and he could never answer them. He would say things like, "Oh, Robert, that was a long time ago." And I thought, so memory becomes a group of things that we want to remember. And if you really want to remember something that it's hard to do to get the brain working that way. So I realized that especially somebody whose relationship with her mother, she now calls her adoptive parent. Would not have been helpful. And I figured, I am, as I said, I believe every word that Christina Crawford said, so I don't think she could find much wrong with what I wrote, but I didn't want to have to be in a, or even explain that I'd spoken to her.
So what were your source materials, and was there anything that you found that was a primary source material that other biographers haven't tapped into?
I like to think all of it. But what I did.
Can you repeat?
Oh, yes. What was my source material, and did I come up with anything that nobody else did? So I answered the last question first. Yes, everything. What I did, because I knew about Crawford, but I didn't know Crawford so well like I thought I knew Garbo, is I decided the first thing I have to do is watch all of her movies. And I decided to watch them in order, starting in 1925. There's 4 or 5 movies that don't exist anymore, part of the silent films that are gone. And remember, we're still in COVID, so we have a certain amount of time. And there's this remarkable, it's called the Internet Data Database, something, At any rate, it's one of these Silicon Valley billionaires who's made it his purpose that he wants everything in the world to be on available. And so everybody's mad at him except me. I sent him money, everybody else is sending money to the Authors Guild, fighting with him because he's digitizing, billions of pages. So you can go into USC, Wisconsin, Museum of Modern Art for journals. I was reading trade journals from 24, 25, 26, 27, and reading everything about the directors, what was happening in MGM as each of these movies were being made and what were the responses. And then what interested me and what I found is the financial records. So how much money they made. And I was, then started charting. Crawford was in this movie, made so much money, she's got a better role. What does she have to do with making the money? Maybe nothing, but then she's in one where she has a leading, and you think, yes, she is moving through the system based on the success, on the one hand, financial, and the fans, because the fans are ultimately the only ones who keep anybody on the screen. That's even the case today. I mean, if people didn't want to see Leonardo DiCaprio, and it baffles me that anybody does, but plenty of people do. So he's always in the movies, but because there are fans there who aren't being. It was the same way then, and he was terrific in whatever happened to Gilbert Grape, and so that kind of thing, launches. Things that I learned was, aside from the fact that all of her movies made money. And how, it's even those terrible movies, Berserk, Trog, they all made money. And well, the best story is with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was made the same year as Cleopatra, Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra. And Elizabeth Taylor signed the first $1 million contract ever. And that was so much money. I don't think anybody had ever signed a contract for more than $250,000. You might remember, Liz Taylor, $1 million Cleopatra. Same year, Joan Crawford was making Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. There, she and Davis are essentially producing it. Crawford works for $10,000. No, Crawford works for $5,000 and Betty Davis works for 10. But $10,000, which is a lot different than $1 million, quite a bit different. So Crawford then wants 10% of the film after they got the money back was something like $800,000 is the cost of the film. Betty Davis took 10,000, so she got 7.5%. Crawford ended up making $1.2 million for Baby Jane against $10,000 or $5,000. So these movies, if you really go into the trade papers, not Life magazine, and certainly not the writers. Nobody has taken the care to look at the financial records and how this was set up and find contracts. And so she was spectacularly successful. But the biggest surprise, aside from the success of the film, was how generous she was, and probably again, it was looking at these contemporary documents from the 30s, is that she paid for 4 rooms at Hollywood Hospital every day, 365 days a year, for people who could not afford to be in the hospital and paid all the doctor's bills. Sometimes she sent her friends there, but if it wasn't her friends, the doctors could fill the room as they like. This was something that was never publicized. And it's like the whole Mommy Dearest with hangers. Crawford lived in a laundry when she was a little girl because they couldn't her mother was a laundress. So she's got these 2 little kids who are sleeping on the floor of the laundry. I know why she was crazy about, wire hangers. She's probably spent, just hanging, the same thing. At some point, she needed medical care. Who knows what it was? And somebody paid a bill for her. And it's so consistent with her character that, okay, now that I'm making $100,000 a year, I'm going to do it. So, she's such a complicated personality.
Having seen all of the Joan Crawford's movies, which are, let's say, top 3.
Well, now Sudden Fear is my favorite, and we're by chance showing that in Norfolk next Friday night. It's film noir from 1952. Crawford is great. Sudden Fear. It's a film noir, one of the great, and her early films, are marvelous. Grand Hotel, is a masterpiece. But it's hard in fairness for any of us, even those of us who spend all our days watching Turner Classic Movies, not to recognize that the movies in the 30s are a little old-fashioned. Crawford goes to Warner Brothers in 1945. She decides the mythical story is that Louis Mayer fires her. Joan, you're too old. You're 38. Forget it. Garbo's gone. Shearer's gone. Louis Mayer desperately wanted to keep Garbo. He offered her a $500,000 5-picture deal, which was plenty of money in 1943. With the war going on, she turned him down. He had to pay her $150,000. For her to leave. She wanted to leave. He still owed her that money. And she signed a better deal with Warner Brothers. She signed a $500,000 deal for 3 pictures of her choice that she could make whenever she wanted.
Wow.
I mean, that's the kind of deal people make in Hollywood today. This is 1943. It took her 2 years to make Mildred Pierce, which, as they say, the rest is history. She won an Oscar. It's still one of the great classics. And then she started making what we call today film noir, possessed, humoresque, Flamingo Road. I mean, a masterpiece, I'd never heard of Flamingo Road, and then Sudden Fear. And then she continued to make superb movies through the 50s.
Not to mention Johnny Guitar.
Johnny Guitar. Well, and Johnny Guitar is a Western, but it's a very modern Western. And I had seen it, and it's a color film. It had been made by Republic Pictures using a kind of film stock that deteriorated very badly. So we could only see these sort of sepia Johnny Guitars. And then, some smart person brought it back to its kind of Technicolor. And this movie is just breathtaking to watch.
Her flaming red lips are just unbelievable. Standing behind the bar. It's crazy.
Yeah,
Crazy.
and it's also, for what was Francois Truffaut, said it's the greatest American film ever made, and it's such an edgy Western. I mean, I don't even want to tell why, but, and Mercedes McCambridge is her foil, and, it's sort of a dykey Western in the 50s with, it's really interesting. It's
Couple of more questions. Is there any movie role that Crawford really, really wanted that she didn't get?
yes, all the ones that Greer Garson made. Random Harvest, Mrs. Miniver. Oh, and this was, she was running around the studio with her hair on fire about this. And Mayer became besotted with Greer Garson and gave her all the good movies. So yeah, that was the one place where she made well, it turned out that because that happened, it caused her to leave. And it completely recharged her career. So would Joan Crawford have been a better Mrs. Miniver? Probably not. But had she, not done that, we would have never gotten Mildred Pierce.
Final question. Congratulations first on the book. It's meticulously researched. It's authoritative. There's enough little gossip sprinkled in here and there, but it is distinctively not your typical Hollywood biography.
Well, thank you for saying that.
Really, really well done. What did you want to achieve with this book in the context of Hollywood biography?
In fact, I didn't want to write a Hollywood biography, and I don't really think of it as a Hollywood biography. I think it is a study in stardom. It's a study in how a person, in this case, a woman, living completely in a man's world, succeeds so mightily. And she succeeds as much through her appearance as from her intelligence, her strategy, when I say manipulation, it's boardroom manipulation. She's in the room with these 4 guys and, she's going to make sure. And that's the story. It's a particular kind of 20th century success story that in a way is interesting as writing about Henry Ford with, people who were very successful, in other businesses, because it's a business.
And the book is available.
Lots. Anybody else have a question before we? All right.
Robert, thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Started that.